Mic okay? Yeah? On behalf of the Institute of Sacred Music, I'm Christian Wiman. Welcome to this evening with Marilyn Robinson. Before we begin, I want to just tell you a couple things. There will be time for a Q&A at the very end, and I think people can just line up right here for that. So when I say that it's time for the Q&A, if you have a question, just come right there. And there'll be a book signing afterwards, and that's going to be a line right here. All right, so Marilyn will sit there, and the line will go right up that aisle right there. Okay? You all know who Marilyn Robinson is, so I'm not going to introduce her, except to say that years ago, I guess I was telling Marilyn this the other day, about 30 years ago, I was living in a trailer in West Texas, and someone sent me Housekeeping, who thought that I would like it. And that became a book that is as important to me as any book I've ever read in my life. I read it then more than once, memorized passages from it, and have taught it here several times. And as you know, then 26 years passed between that book and Marilyn's next novel, and people wondered if she was going to write any more novels or what had happened. And then another one came, Gilead, which you all know about. And there have since been more in that series, and she actually has another book. Is it called Jack?
Yep.
Yeah, called Jack. Continuing that series coming out this fall. So I thought I would start, Marilyn, maybe by asking you, maybe the first place to start is, what are you teaching here at Yale? What are you teaching for us?
Well, I'm teaching Shakespeare, only three plays, the big ones, Hamlet, Lear, and Winter's Tale. Well, my big ones. And what I'm doing is talking about the theological environment that surrounded the writing of these plays, the creation of this vision of these plays. Oddly enough, people fail to realize that the Renaissance and the Reformation in England were absolutely simultaneous, and that a lot of the people who were important to the Reformation were important to the Renaissance. You know, the major writers of the period, in many cases, were very sympathetic with, you know, with the theology that was coming from the continent and so on. And this was such an important phenomenon, the emergence of the Reformation within this context, that I think it's really shortchanging Shakespeare and his audience to assume, to exclude this kind of theological consciousness that was obviously pervasive in the cultural and the intellectual life of the period when he wrote, and also was popular in the sense that it was directed toward a popular audience who would have been his audience. There's actually a theological conversation within Shakespeare's work that I think is overlooked because the importance of what was happening in the culture at that time is also overlooked.
How would you say that she has a doctorate in Shakespeare? I don't know if those of you know that, but how would you say reading Shakespeare over the years has influenced what you write, what you've chosen to write?
Well, for one thing, it's influenced my nonfiction writing in a very sort of broad way, because when I was in graduate school, I suffered a very important disillusionment. I found out that people that wrote criticism did not read history, and that all sorts of allusions just, you know, passed them by, and there were all sorts of very, very unfortunate misinterpretations that were based on the fact of that omission. And so that, you know, I had my own little experience of, what do they call it? That phrase in criticism, you know, disillusionment, what can I say? So I started writing things that basically proceeded on the assumption, which I could virtually always justify, that not enough reading had been done, not enough background had been mastered to support many, many, many of the ideas that I found everywhere in American cultural and intellectual life, endlessly repeated, endlessly reinstilled in classrooms and so on. So I have that tendency in my nonfiction to be highly skeptical and to pursue skepticism fruitfully, I find, to my satisfaction. As far as my fiction is concerned, I think that if you read Shakespeare deeply enough, attentively enough, he never leaves your consciousness. He becomes a sort of dialect of thinking. And I mean, you will see this. I was going to make a bold separation of myself with this last novel and center it on Milton, but Shakespeare just creeps in, you know, I mean.
In what way? You mean that one of the characters is interested in Shakespeare, or the language is?
Well, when I was young, when I was in high school and so on, in a very remote place, you know, people would have cultural ambitions that would make them readers of Milton or Shakespeare. It was, I mean, have you ever noticed how rural names in this country are always names like Homer and Virgil? Not an accident, you know? And people, things, I mean, my grandfather or my father used to make allusions all the time that I didn't understand the significance of until I was in college in many cases. And so I'm just kind of reproducing what I think was a consequence of the fact that, you know, that in public high school we did read Shakespeare and so on, you know. So it's realism.
Mm-hmm. There's a wonderful quote by George MacDonald about George Herbert saying the sound, I don't know exactly the words, but the sound of the voice is a harbinger of the truth contained therein. And I often think of that with someone like Shakespeare, that the sound penetrates you before you have recognized what it's saying. And I wonder if you feel that when you're writing fiction.
It is true that when I'm writing fiction often, or nonfiction sometimes, I know what a sentence should sound like before I know what it should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, enough chit chat. What does the word mysticism mean to you?
Well, you know, there are two versions of what mysticism is. One is sort of transcendent meaning, breaking in on ordinary experience, you know, a vision, something like that. And then there is the Reformation version of mysticism, which is, you know, the Reformation is called the democratization of mysticism because it taught that anyone can have a vision, in effect, simply by an open and appropriate attention to what is true, you know, to what light is, what it is to encounter another human being. That kind of mysticism attracts me very, very deeply. I don't like the idea, really, that you have to go outside the terms of the given experience in order to have an experience of the highest order of profundity, you know.
Do you feel a tension between that definition of mysticism and your life in, say, the church?
Oh, yes. You know, I've belonged to the same church for about 30 years, a smallish church on a street corner in Iowa City. And I'm devoted to it, and it is so secondary, it's second nature to me in a certain sense. I assume that I do not have the same vision of things as perhaps many people in the church, you know. bro, there's nothing about it that imposes any. You know what I mean? It's sort of like, here is the occasion, you know. I don't really, frankly, maybe it was my upbringing or something, but my religious experience isn't really terribly dependent on a church.
On a church. Yeah, you seem at ease with it. See, I was going to ask, how do you reconcile your experience of, say, the intensity of the moments in Housekeeping? I'll have you read one in a minute, one passage, but the intensity of moments described or experienced, because in some of your essays you describe actual experiences that seem to me like mystical experiences, as in Psalm 8. Mm-hmm. But then you write in such a way, you seem to also be very comfortable within given doctrine, given dogma. And I find that a real abrading tension. Like, for me, it's not an easy existence. And I wonder, is that a fair description of you? Do you feel at ease in that way?
Well, you know, it's partly that sort of exploratory habit I have of seeing what lies behind what is presented to me as true, you know. It's been true of mainline Protestantism that they have discarded many things from the past because they are from the past without making other kinds of qualitative judgments, you know. And so I read traditional religious thought, and, you know, like contemporary religious thought, there's part of it that is moving and part of it that obviously is not compatible with my thinking. But at the same time, I must say, traditionally, the prose is a lot better.
With someone like Karl Barth, would you disagree with someone like that who really was against the mystical experience? He thought that, you know, you had Christ was the only way of experiencing God, that what we have been given in Christ, and for everyone to go around claiming that they had access to mystical experience was just confusion.
I don't agree.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Me neither, but I wrestle with it anyway. Let me have you read this. Okay, so the Carthage passage.
Okay. I will say, as I find my glasses, wrong glasses, that that this whole passage is based on the Latin book that I had in high school.
And if you don't know the novel, this character Ruthie has gone off with Sylvie the aunt, and who's Sylvie is kind of how would you describe her? Not a trustworthy guardian, but a wonderful, imaginative person, and they've gone off and spent the night together. And then Sylvie has left, and Ruthie is alone, and she must be how old in this? 15? Yeah.
Right. Imagine a Carthage sown with salt, and all the sowers gone, and the seeds lain however long in the earth, till there arose finally in vegetable profusion leaves and trees of rime and brine. What flowering would there be in such a garden? Light would force each salt calyx to open in prisms and to fruit heavily with bright globes of water. Peaches and grapes are little more than that, and where the world was salt, there would be greater need of slaking. For need can blossom into all the compensations it requires. To crave and to have are as like as a thing and its shadow. For when does a berry break upon the tongue so sweetly as when one longs to taste it? And when is the taste refracted into so many hues and savors of ripeness and earth? And when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it? And here again is a foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. For to wish for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. So whatever we may lose, very craving gives it back to us again. Though we dream and hardly know it, longing, like an angel, fosters us, smooths our hair, and brings us wild strawberries.
Now I've heard you say that you wanted to be, or you wished you were a poet. Why don't you just take that out of the novel? And you have a nice little poem right there.
If I told myself it was a poem, I couldn't do it.
Yeah. I wonder what your experience of art has to do, both making it and experiencing it, has to do with your notions of mysticism. Like that seems to be a mystical experience there.
Yeah, it is. It's a mystical experience. It's also an act of memory and yearning, and I mean, our ordinary minds, under scrutiny or at high levels of activity, they are the channel through which this kind of mysticism that I'm talking about comes. I mean, one of the things I like about the 17th century Protestant writers is that they were amazed with human beings because they understood them as being these sort of prisms through which sacred experience poured, And so you have them like studying eyesight, people like Isaac Newton and so on, studying light, there's a, very strong sense of the human being as the knower, the entity that gives meaning to everything because we are capable of perception. We're central in that way. And then everything that is perception, everything that, that makes perception possible is a statement about the nature of God, in effect, which I think is beautiful. I mean, which I think is true, actually, just not to mince words.
I remember when I read that book, To Crave and to Have Are as Like as a Thing in Its Shadow. I remember thinking that was incredibly beautiful, but also incredibly sorrowful. The sorrow and the beauty were fused in a way. And I wonder if that's changed for you over the years, or if you recognize that person, if it's very different, or if the things you've written since then seem to have come from a different place.
I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. You try to write from a different place, At the same time, I do think that my characters are maybe untypically lonely. I do think, I mean, we have the opportunity to be lonely in the sense of withdrawing into a self that is the perceiver, the reflector, We don't, I mean, the way that every model of happiness that's posed to us now has everything to do with interaction and connection and all the rest of it. I think that that's a very much a narrowing down of more beautiful aspects of human possibility. I don't think I could keep interest in a character who was socially assimilated, shall we say.
So you don't see John Ames as being socially, the minister in Gilead as being socially assimilated?
Well, he's not socially assimilated in a world of people who are not socially assimilated, which is sort of my biography in a nutshell. But he does go through that very long period of being unmarried and the widower who finds liver pills that have been left on his kitchen table,
What does loneliness have to do with religious experience for you?
Well, as Augustine did say, every one of us is an only child. And I think that, that's a kind of a fearsome thought. But at the same time, it's also the great, the universal dignity of being what we are, that our lives deserve the kind of scrutiny that we can give them, and that they are beautiful in their own right, without dependency on any external notion of what their significance might be.
Do you feel that alleviated, that loneliness alleviated? I guess I wonder, I often understand loneliness as being a vehicle towards comprehending God. I'm not averse to the idea that God experiences loneliness. It's a kind of heresy, but I wonder, do you experience God easing loneliness? Or is it always
Well,
kind of echo?
I mean, I think that God eases loneliness, but it's not the loneliness that we're used to thinking of as loneliness, you know? The idea of God gives life meaning, and meaning is the cure for loneliness, in my experience, my understanding. Nobody else can give you meaning in that same way, and God does not give you a solution to loneliness in the way that we ordinarily think of that being solved as a social or personal problem.
I mentioned Fanny Howe, the writer Fanny Howe, to you the other day, and she has a passage about a character from one of her novels that you become it's about being solitary. You become an easy channel for the invisible, she says. You may be lonely, but you are not empty, which I think is a good way of putting it.
Mm-hmm.
You may be lonely, but you are not empty. But then there's a kind of loneliness that's probably, well, I know there is. It's kind of more annihilating and more inhibiting.
Well, I think that that's true, and I think that one of the things that we have done in the modern period that is sad is that we've discouraged people or made them inarticulate in finding the experience of God in their lives, you know, that asserting for themselves, to themselves, the kind of dignity and significance that comes with believing that they do indeed have God's attention, and that, you know, at that really cosmic level, to live well, to do justice and love kindness and all that are things of the most absolute importance. You can be as lonely as you want to and still be entirely capable of loving mercy. You know?
So I want you to read this passage too. Think of it you can think of it in light of what she read from Housekeeping. So this is John Ames, who's written this letter to his son. I have been thinking about existence lately, to the end of that.
Okay. I've been thinking about existence lately. In fact, I've been so full of admiration for existence that I've hardly been able to enjoy it properly. As I was walking up to the church this morning, I passed that row of big oaks by the War Memorial, if you remember them, and I thought of another morning, fall a year or two ago, when they were dropping their acorns thick as hail almost. There was all sorts of thrashing in the leaves, and then there were acorns hitting the pavement so hard they'd fly past my head. All this in the dark, of course. I remember a slice of moon, no more than that. It was a very clear night or morning, very still, and there was such energy in the things transpiring among those trees, like a storm, like travail. I stood there a little out of range, and I thought, it is all still new to me. I have lived my life on the prairie, and a line of oak trees can still astonish me. I feel sometimes as if I were a child who opens its eyes on the world once and sees amazing things it will never know any names for, and then has to close its eyes again. I know this is all mere apparition compared to what awaits us, but it is only lovelier for that. There is a human beauty in it. And I can't believe that when we have all been changed and put on incorruptibility, we will forget our fantastic condition of mortality and impermanence, the great bright dream of procreating and perishing that meant the whole world to us. In eternity, this world will be Troy, I believe, and all that has passed here will be the epic of the universe, the ballad they sing in the streets. Because I don't imagine any reality putting this one in the shade entirely, and I think piety forbids me to try.
See, for me, that's a very different tone than the one in Housekeeping. The one in Housekeeping seems to me akin to Emily Dickinson's Sumptuous Destitution. It's a kind of destitution that creates its own abundance. To crave and to have, or is like as a thing in its shadow. But in the latter one, it seems to almost be coming from above downward. And that's why I wondered if you experienced them in different ways.
That's always kind of a difficult question for me because I'm completely dependent on my narrator. And you know, John Ames is completely saturated with highly articulated religious experience, you know, and Ruthie not. She's a, you know, catch as catch can, you know, of interest to the authorities kind of a kid, you know. And she has the terms that I would have had. I made a kind of discipline of that, you know, like using the Latin textbook and so on, you know. But she has there's no model of reality that has authority for her, and she's creating a reality that she can live in.
Have you ever gone through a time when there was no model of reality for you? Like, I asked this again, I think of Fanny Howe, because I was once doing one of these events with her, and she told me that she could wake up as an atheist and go to bed as a believer the same day, many times a week, you know, just that it would happen over and over. And I wondered have you ever gone through that? Felt that distance from God?
Well, you know, one of the things that's interesting is that some people feel a distance from God as a question about the existence of God, which is very, I think, egocentric. My feeling of distance from God, when I feel it, is that I am distant from God, not doubting the actual reality of either term, you know. When I was in high school, my brother was in college, and he would send me everything that he was reading. You know, he'd come home with trunks full of books, and then I'd read my way through these things, and I was reading way over my head all the time. But, you know, so Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, all these crazy people. And so I decided that atheism was probably it, you know, probably looking reality in the eye. So I was an atheist for about a month. And it was a terrible experience. It really felt, I mean, I was used to thinking in kind of cosmic terms, frankly, a very large universe, you know. And then you get this little sour determinist disillusion. It felt like the ceiling had come down on my head. I couldn't tolerate it. I thought nothing that I have to reject as unbeautiful can also be true, you know. It's just it's desensitizing, really. I mean, if you go into the world on the assumption that you're going to see something there that absolutely matters, that's a different experience, and it alters your perception of what you see, you know. I remember reading Nausea, an accurately titled book, if there was. And, you know, that is a very, very narrow worldview that is being propagated there, and there was nothing to credit in it. It was too bad.
But what about Wallace Stevens, for instance? I know you're a great admirer of Wallace Stevens, and he described himself as an atheist. And you certainly wouldn't say that he had that grim materialistic worldview pressing down on him. In fact, it seems the opposite. You know, it's all lights and jubilation, flamboyance, and energy. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder how you reconcile those two things.
Oh, I think he just called himself an atheist to keep people from pursuing the question.
So he was an anonymous Christian, like Carl Rahner's anonymous?
Yes, exactly. Well, you know, a lot of his poems are just visionary, you know? I mean,
yeah.
They're so full of a particular kind of transcendence. And it's not, you know, it's not empty transcendence. It's full of this sense of some sort of aesthetic energy behind reality. I think that if you have reached that point, you can't use the word atheist anymore.
What is the word, though? What would you use? Because it is a kind of creation out of the void. Lear is like that. There's a kind of extreme energy and creativeness coming out of nothingness. And so if it's not, go ahead.
Well, you know, he has his tropics, and he has, you know, I mean, he proceeds in the way of an American poet looking at the world, whatever world it happens to be. And I mean, you know, like Carlos Williams would do also, any common thing, any ray of light. And you know, there is no nothingness. If you're attentive to the world, there is no nothingness. It's all amazement. It's all extraordinary. You know, when you know, reading over again Paradise Lost, you know, and Satan, that wonderful Satan flying toward the earth. And you know, there are these strange, monstrous forces and so on out in the, you know, in the abyss. And then there's this little jewel hanging by a chain from heaven. And that's a pretty good description of the universe, you know? I mean, if you look at what the world is and what the world is as set in the cosmos, and, you know, how it looks under closer and closer examination and more distant examination and so on, nothing could be more remarkable than that. No myth, no fantasy, nothing, you know. We have this way of acting as if we somehow participate in a kind of dull and pedestrian reality, you know. You don't have to read or look very far into it to realize that it's just as astonishing as it could be, you know. Read about something like the operations of the immune system, or, you know, I mean, there is no place that you can go in terms of knowing anything deeply without just being astonished.
Can you tell me, I read somewhere you describing asking a class, must have been in Iowa, of writers about to describe their view of human nature. Do you remember that? And what it had to do then with their fiction that they produced?
Oh yes, I remember that.
Can you say something about that? Because they all had a similar view of human nature, right? Was it materialistic or Freudian or Darwinian? Or
something? I mean that there's a terrible similarity among these anthropologies that we've seen go by in the last 100 years. That they are very reductionist in the sense that they imagine motives and so on that are, you know, if I were simply to say to somebody, all you care about is material advantage, that's all you care about. Everything you do, that's what, you know, it would be an insult, right? And there's virtually no anthropology that's been offered to us since, you know, Darwin, I suppose, well, you know, that is not an insult to human nature. First of all, by projecting a kind of an idiotic simplicity on the human mind and behavior and the rest, which it's always irritated me, but now it seems to me to be very threatening because I'm afraid we've kind of lost the idea of humanism. I'm afraid we've forgotten why we should be loyal to the well-being of other people, which is a frightening loss, you know. And it's interesting, I mean, I'm going to say something, you know, I'm going to say something I always want to say and seldom do. The universities are very much responsible for this. those crazy ideas would never float in any other context. But since they're taught in places that convey authority to the ideas that they propose, people actually go through their lives thinking, you know, that they have an id or something, you know?
You say somewhere else, I wanted to ask you about that, you say beauty disciplines. Remember
Yes.
that? What do you mean by that?
I mean, for some reason, I mean, it seems quite amazing to me. I mean, you know, I'm very reassured by finding that mathematicians talk about beauty, and, you know, people that do any kind of theoretical work like that tend to talk about beauty as something that makes plausible an idea, a shapeliness, you know. There's, you know, objectively speaking, no reason why this should be true, but it seems to me as though it is highly demonstrable, all sorts of things that people make and do and so on. People, you know, and singled out as having been exceptional among the things that are made, you know. People have an instinct for the importance of the beautiful, which, you know, by the grace of God, is an enormously complex and mutable standard, you know, that can be re-expressed in different terms over and over again in ages and cultures and all the rest of it. And people can be educated to new perceptions of beauty, and this is kind of the cultural history of the human race, you know. But, so, you know, beauty doesn't lend itself to a simple definition, but at the same time, I think a very great part of the time it's what we're aspiring toward, even if the aspiration means stepping beyond what are at that moment accepted notions of what the beautiful is. So it's a sort of chimera that's, you know, that floats ahead of us. And, you know, I mean, people talk about inspiration, and I don't know what they mean by that. But I do think that one of the important things about the kind of activity that people take as inspiration is discipline. No, I can't do that. That would be awkward. That would be inhumane. That would be, you know, whatever. You know.
So you never felt inspired when writing your books?
I don't feel inspired, I think, in the way that other people understand the term. Things happen. I mean, like, I cannot write a novel until there's a voice in my head. I have no idea where these voices come from. You know, I was so surprised that I was suddenly, you know, channeling, as they say, you know, an elderly clergyman. But there he was, and there he was until the book was done, you know. So there's something happens, but after you've, I mean, and talking about disciplining, you know, you get this character in your mind, and then there are all kinds of yes/no judgments that are made thereafter. No, he wouldn't have said that. No, he wouldn't have done that. Yes, he would have said that. Yes, you know what I mean? So that you're continuously following what feels like the grain in a certain kind of reality, you know. And who knows why that is? I have no idea, except insofar as anything is shapely or composed, you know, I'm sure anybody that's carving wood is probably doing something of a similar kind.
So how was that in being in the head of Jack? Because I would describe him as a pretty ragged unbeliever.
Oh, you know, you can't make these judgments about people.
So you said he's always going to talk to the minister, right?
Yeah, and to argue with him, and, you know, I mean, it's very nice ministers. I'm so kind to ministers. You will like these guys. But in any case, he, in a way, sort of, it seems to me as if a great part of this culture and other cultures that have similar heritages, like England and France and so on, people are in some strange space between, you know, having a religious culture unforgettably present in their memory, in their habits even, in their language, at the same time that the cultures signal to you all the time that is excluded in effect. That isn't anymore how people structure their thoughts, And I think that a lot of people sort of vacillate between feeling incredibly secular and at the same time, inclining back toward what have been implicit cultural values and harmonies and so on. Who knows how many generations this tension will continue, but I think it's very true now. I was in France, I was in southern France, and I was reading from Gilead, and people wept. And here I am, they killed people like me in southern France. But there is that in Christendom, I think, that, and probably in other religious cultures too, that vacillate in the same way, some deep, moving memory that feels like truth, and it's there, and that's like Jack, a little bit.
Do you think art enables that experience for people in a way that religion used to?
I don't. I don't even think it's truthful for artists to say that they're attempting that. And frankly, I think that they are honest to the extent that they disallow that possibility.
So for you, an experience of art is completely different from a religious experience?
Well, they're not the same. It's so hard, because of the history of Western civilization, so much music, so much architecture, so much just the representation of the human form can carry religious connotations that are associative and so on in the painter's mind and in the viewer's mind, whether or not the intention is religious. So it's kind of hard to say. But, I look at Cubism or something like that, and I think, well, fine.
Back to me, okay. I'm trying to think. I want her to read one more thing before we get to questions. Maybe I'll just ask you one question because I'm very curious about it for myself. You have said in that same beautiful essay, there's an essay called Psalm 8, which if you guys haven't read that, it's extraordinary, in her first book of essays. But you've said that you flatter yourself that you understand John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas and all these people, but you don't understand the Bible. Do you remember that? And so I was struck by that because you write about the Bible quite a bit. And so I was wondering what you mean by that kind of lack of understanding, and how you respond to the Bible differently from other kinds of writing.
Well, the Bible really is very different. In the sense that the tendency, it reads like other ancient history in the sense that there's tribalism and people are being slain and the king is losing his mind and all that. Geoffrey of Monmouth talks about that too, it's human history. But in the Bible, there is the attempt to retrieve high meaning out of things that often befell that culture as catastrophes, There's a way in which the effort to sustain or to recover a sense of the justice of God and so on is something that's taken on at tremendous cost to the people who are making this justification, It's amazing how, anything bad that happens in the Bible, the population that is afflicted says, we have sinned. This is extraordinary in human culture. The idea that the only people that I know who, that had that same tendency are people, early American people like Lincoln and so on, who would say every drop of blood that was drawn by the lash was answered by one drawn by the sword. That there is a cosmic justice that you have to acknowledge when it comes at your own cost, And we don't do that. You never hear that anymore. But it's pervasive in the Old Testament. And it creates that, it creates the kind of consciousness that, for example, makes what presents itself as understandable as a crime, which is the crucifixion of an innocent man, as being something that is in fact a great rescue, that is accessible to being completely interpreted in terms of the understanding of, yes, great violence on the one hand, and on the other hand, a great revelation of meaning, of, I don't know if that's clear.
Let me have you read one more passage with, and you guys think of questions you want to ask. This is, and I choose this because it bears on much that we've been talking about, whether the relation between art and religious experience, art and the church, and also because it's just so beautiful. And it's about a vision. So I was speaking of visions.
Okay, how far do I go?
Well, do you want to just read until the scene ends? Like right there, is that too much?
Okay, no, that's
Okay.
fine. I was speaking of visions. I remember once when I was a young child, my father helped to pull down a church that had burned. Lightning struck the steeple, and then the steeple fell into the building. It rained the day we came to pull it down. The pulpit was left intact, standing there in the rain, but the pews were mostly kindling. There was a lot of praising the Lord that had happened at midnight on a Tuesday. It was a warm day, a warm rain, and there was no real shelter, so everybody ignored it, more or less. All kinds of people came to help. It was like a camp meeting and a picnic. They unhitched the horses, and we younger children lay on an old quilt under the wagon out of the way, and talked and played marbles and watched the older boys and the men clamber over the ruins, searching out Bibles and hymnals. They would sing, we would all sing, Blessed Jesus and the old rugged cross, and the wind would blow the rain in gusts, and the spray would reach us where we were. It was cooler than the rain was. The rain falling on the wagon bed sounded the way it does in an attic. In an attic eave. It never rains, but I remember that day, and when they had gathered up all the books that were ruined, they made 2 graves for them and put the Bibles in one and the hymnals in the other. And then the minister whose church it was, a Baptist as I recall, said a prayer over them. I was always amazed watching grown-ups at the way they seemed to know what was to be done in any situation, to know what was the decent thing. The women put the pies and cakes they had brought and the books that could still be used into our wagon, and then covered the bed with planks and tarps and lap robes. The food was all pretty damp. No one seemed to have thought there might be rain, and harvest was coming, so they'd have been too busy to come back again for a good while. They put that pulpit under a tree and covered it with a horse blanket, and they salvaged whatever they could, which amounted mainly to shingles and nails, and then they pulled down everything that was still standing to make a bonfire when it all dried out. The ashes turned liquid in the rain, and the men who were working in the ruins got entirely black and filthy, till you could hardly tell one from another. My father brought me some biscuit that had soot on it from his hands. Never mind, he said, there's nothing cleaner than ash. But it affected the taste of that biscuit, which I thought might resemble the bread of affliction, which was often mentioned in those days, though it's rather forgotten now. Strange are the uses of adversity, that's a fact. When I'm up here in my study with the radio on and some old book in my hands, and it's nighttime and the wind blows and the house creaks, I forget where I am. And it's as though I was back in hard times for a minute or two, and there's a sweetness in the experience that I don't understand, but that only enhances the value of it. My point here is that you never do know the actual nature of, even of your own experience. Or perhaps it has no fixed and certain nature. I remember my father down on his heels in the rain, water dripping from his hat, feeding me biscuit from his scorched hand, with that old blackened wreck of a church behind him, and steam rising from the rain that fell on, and steam rising where the rain fell on embers. The rain falling in gusts and the women singing the old rugged cross while they saw to things, moving so gently as if they were dancing to the hymn almost. In those days, no grown woman ever let herself be seen with her hair undone, but that day, even the grand old women had their hair falling down their backs like schoolgirls. It was so joyful and sad. I mention it because it seems to me much of my life was comprehended in that moment. Grief itself has often returned me to that morning when I took communion from my father's hand. I remember it as communion, and I believe that's what it was.
Beautiful. So we have time for some questions. I guess if you project, we can repeat them, or you can come down here to the mic. Yeah, go ahead. Somebody, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Shelley, and I'm a pastor. And I couldn't be more different from John Ames, but I have to tell you, I want to thank you, because I've read so many books over the years and seen so many movies where pastors are not gotten. You got us. Thank you.
My pleasure. I'm glad you were there to be got. You know, it's an odd thing about this culture, since I'm talking, ex cathedra, that we tend to injure and diminish the things that we value. I mean, when I sit in a line and people come get their books signed, they say, oh, he reminds me of my pastor. Oh, my father was a pastor. My son is a pastor. Oh, they are so important. You know what I mean? And then they sit down to write a book, and the pastor is a fiend or a decadent of some kind. Why do we do that? And why do we do it with the kind of consistency that means when you don't do it, it's like you've struck out into a new territory?
I heard that you were going to write a book of essays about the Old Testament. I wondered if that was still happening, or if you could speak to some of the content of that book.
You might have to repeat.
Yeah, okay. He has asked me about a book that I have actually promised my publisher for about 20 years at this point. Essays about the Old Testament. And I gave a series of lectures at Cambridge, 8 lectures on the Old Testament a couple of years ago, which means that I have the core of this book, basically. One of the 1,000 things that irritates me, I'm a curmudgeon. No, I'm not. I'm critical in a very enlightened way. But the way in which this sort of documentary system theory of interpretation of criticism of the Old Testament has really dominated Old Testament studies for 150 years. What was so magical about, 150 years ago? So many bad ideas came out of exactly that period, But in any case, if you get into the text, the fine detail of the text and all the questions that can be raised about everything, then you know, there is no rebuttal to the documentary hypothesis. It seems as plausible as, you know. But if you look at it from the point of view of narrative shapes and how they interact, how the paradigm is established and played on in other overarching, you know, systems of meaning in effect, you can bypass a documentary hypothesis by showing that the coherency of the text occurs at another scale, you know. And I think that that's very, very demonstrable. I think it's a huge liberation of the great, great, great literature of the Old Testament, which is really, I mean, one of the things that we people, Western people, have done in, you know, in our complicated history is produce a lot of good literature, and it tends to be the Bible that has lain behind it formally and in many other ways. But we obscure the sources of most of what we've done culturally, you know, the last 500 years.
Yeah.
On that note of the Old Testament, one of the things I've always been struck by with Gilead is in the opening of the narrative, Amos tells the story of how he goes to find his grandfather's grave. And there's this scene where he stays with his father, with a widow, and she gives him milk and cares for him. And I always am struck by thinking about the references, if this is a possible allusion to the story of the prophet Lila and how he stays with the widows out in First Kings.
You know, it's hard for me to know. I mean, people point out to me, well, the book of Ruth is about a woman named Ruth and a woman named, well, Naomi, and they're wandering, and the, you know, and I think, well, yes, now that you've pointed that out. But it's, you know, it is truer of the Bible than it is of Shakespeare, that if you read it, if you know it, it takes over your brain in a certain sense, I think. I've never, you know, I mean, they say that, you know, home is a crib too closely from the narrative of the prodigal son. I don't believe that's true, but I also wasn't thinking of the narrative of the prodigal son when I wrote the book. I don't know how I obscure these obvious things for myself, but I do.
Do we have, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned several different writers, Calvin, the Protestant writers, the Reformation, and so on. If you had one theologian that you maybe admired or have most closely to, do you have one that you sort of pick out as?
So it's one, just in case you can't hear at the back, he's asking if there's one theologian that is her favorite.
Well, you know, I keep returning to Calvin because he is so undervalued. I mean, like, so undervalued. And as far as I'm concerned, he's a metaphysical writer. You understand Descartes in terms of him, or at his best moments, Locke in terms of him, or whatever. I think that he tends to be taught as being a kind of a dead weight on Western thought, you know, when in fact I think he's the absolute source of a great many of the most interesting movements in Western thought. And without question, he's the most important theologian of any period. He's certainly the most influential Frenchman who ever lived. Tell that to a Frenchman.
We have time for maybe one more.
But John Flavel, F-L-A-V-E-L.
Yeah.
Talking of language that permeates, it seems to me when I first read Gilead and later when I read Lila, the characters are so filled with scripture, as you say, and it just sort of comes out of them, whether or not they need to be quoting it or not. Lila eventually, but obviously John didn't. And it struck me that very similar of Shakespeare's plays. Not that his, the characters in the plays are speaking the text of scripture, but that Shakespeare himself is just full of allusions that seem to be sort of have different levels of intentionality. So I was wondering if that's something you yourself had ever noticed, or where you feel like the level of intentionality is for you with the scripture is permeating the language of your characters.
Well, I think that, I write, I'm often writing characters that come from a context where that text would be very, very well known. Somebody who goes to a church every Sunday and hears a sermon that might be half an hour long, after a while you're acquainted with the text, One of the things that's very interesting, Shakespeare wrote in a period when the Bible in English was off and on, but in important ways prohibited. William Tyndale, who'd made the first English language translation in the modern period of the New Testament, was burned for it, Henry VIII promised there would never be a Bible in English. And so there's something, it was kind of like a hot book at the time that Shakespeare was writing. And it was popular in the sense that it was a great liberation from the point of view of people who had not had access to it, the vast majority of people who had no Latin. And so I think there's a kind of intensity and a kind of direct address in his using the Bible as often as he does in his plays. It's kind of cheeky, too, because, it makes a point.
Thank you again, man. Thank you very much. So again, Marilyn will be signing books. Books for sale up here, and she'll be signing books. Lisa?